And so we are live. Hi, Zoe. How's it going?
Hi, good, Sam. Great to be here.
It's so good to see you. And what I found with this is that people start like jumping in slowly in ones and twos, and you get like a critical mass after about a couple minutes. But there will also be a recording of this that like maybe I will share or we can share. And so, welcome. I'll do a little bit of an intro for you.
Mhm.
Zoe Rom, host of Your Diet Sucks, co-host, excuse me, with Callie Van Horn. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah, just pumped to be here. Long time reader of the Substack. So excited to pick your brain whilst you pick mine.
I know, I know. I'm a little nervous because I don't know what you're gonna ask me. I know I'm gonna ask you, but I'm not sure what you're gonna ask me or how you're gonna bounce stuff around. I
How
wanted to ask
interviews work, Sam. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a little bit just to start off, because I have been following your writing for like quite some time, like back to sort of like the Trail Runner magazine days. I think we actually almost intersected there. It's sort of like an interesting story. I don't remember who the editor in chief was. There was like in like 2017, but like I chatted with him a little bit about maybe going to work for Trail Runner at some point, and then didn't do it. But
I,
tell
I
me a little
mean,
bit about your background.
with the hindsight of knowing how digital media has gone, I would say that's a really good career career move. No, yeah, but I mean, it was a really fun sort of early career job. I had been working at in PR, was like my first job out of grad school, and got pretty burned out because of just kind of the demands of of daily news. I was working at the NPR station in Aspen, primarily covering the outdoor industry, the ski economy, climate and environmental stuff, and it was like first real journalism job, and just got really burned out because of
Yeah,
what it required and hosting morning edition. And it's NPR is just kind of an intense place, for which is good. I think journalism should be intense,
yeah.
but that
Wait,
sort of inspired me to make the jump to trail runner early on.
yeah, and what was your where did you study? Like, what was your background? Like, where did you
Yeah.
grow up?
I actually grew up in rural Arkansas, so I've always been really interested in food and agriculture. My dad is both a professor of sustainable agriculture, and I grew up on a family apple orchard, so, like, grew up on a
Oh,
working farm harvesting apples, and it was, like, weird to me that not everyone, like, did that, like, had to work at a farmer's market as a child, like, growing their own food. And was always just really interested in the intersection of climate justice and sustainable agriculture, particularly growing up in rural Arkansas, which has its own sort of suite of environmental and food justice issues. I come from a part of the world that grows a lot of the food that people eat, and yet has
yeah,
one of the highest rates of insecurity in the United States. And so I was always really interested in that um, gap. And my undergraduate degree was in ecopoetics. I really just wanted to study poetry. And then, like, in my senior year, I zagged and was like, oh my God, I have no skills beyond like writing adult book reports. I should probably learn how to do a single thing. And I was like, I was potentially pursue like going down sort of a pathway that would have led me to academia, which is like
yeah,
everyone in my family is professors. So I sort of wanted to like I wanted to do like a trade. So I kind of at the last minute sort of tacked on a journalism degree to my English
yeah,
major, and really fell in love with it. This was at the time that like Serial was the like new hot podcast, and I was working at my local NPR station doing a food podcast. I helped them start one of their first ever podcasts, and I got really excited about that medium and the potential of that medium because it's so accessible. And I thought it really bridged this gap between the nonprofit, like 24/7, like NPR model that I loved, and finding a way to bring that same thing to my generation, to millennials, and package it in a way that felt a bit more on demand and that felt a bit more like I was meeting people from my generation where they were. So I moved to Boulder, Colorado to get a master's degree in environmental journalism. Because this was in 2016. So it seemed like at the time I was like, there was a fascinating presidential race that made me especially interested in trying to draw to environmental issues, particularly as someone from the rural South. I felt like that perspective wasn't often in a lot of the environmental journalism I was seeing, or even in the environmental movement. So I wanted to sort of bring perspective as a rural or someone with a background in agriculture, um, to environmental and outdoor writing.
Yeah. Oh man. So like 2016. So very like it's in the water. Like a lot of those like
Yeah.
just I don't know, just sort of like the temperature, right, had just spiked right then. And I don't know, it's never gone down since then. But that was like the fever
Yeah,
pitch
I
of
mean,
like,
there was a
yeah,
moment where, like, watching Trump come down the escalator, I was like, "Oh my god, this is a crazy fluke." Like, we definitely need journalists more than ever, but thank goodness that, like, obviously this will never happen. So,
yeah, yeah.
it was definitely an interesting time to get into journalism.
Yeah. And so did you always have a background as a distance runner? Like was that did you do grow up doing
No.
sports or
Yeah, I was a
yeah,
late in life, runner.
yeah.
I started running in college. I was not an athletic kid at all. I actually tried out for my high school's cross country team, and they were like, "Why don't you come back and try to do the high jump in spring?" Like, "We love your enthusiasm. Thanks, but no thanks." So I played volleyball, and by played, I mean I warmed the bench, but I just, like, was not an athletic kid. I kinda wanted to I was a wannabe athlete, and then in college, when I was working as a backpacking guide out in New Mexico, I started, like, hiking and running to, like, get in better shape for guiding because I definitely had this feeling as, like, a younger like, I was an 18, 19, 20-year-old woman guiding primarily men. I felt like I had to be the strongest, fastest, most competent guide, so I started sort of training as, like, a compensatory measure for being a young woman in the guiding industry, but just
Mhm.
ended up falling in love with it and spending time on feet out in the backcountry, and it started as training for backpacking, but then eventually I was like, "Man, this is way more fun when I don't have a giant backpack on and I
Yeah.
can, just carry a few snacks and a bottle of water and be done by lunch."
Yeah, yeah, and cover a lot of more ground probably too.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I have always like, kind of known your before discovering your most recent podcast, which we will get to, that a lot of your writing and I think this I mean, some of it is, like, a little bit topical of, like, the mid-2010s and, like, it's interesting, like, environmentalism seems a little bit quieter right now. I don't know, maybe I'm just not paying attention, but a lot of your writing has been, like, bringing a climate perspective or climate awareness perspective, or a lot of your writing then, or a lot of your work then was sort of oriented around that. Sustainability, like you wrote a book about like sustainability more generally, with as in regards to running. Um, and you brought that, as I recall, to some of the work that you were doing in Trail Runner. Can you talk about that? Sorry, that was not a
Yeah,
question, more of an
no,
observation than a question, but like
that
really
is a
interesting how you
very
start
good,
bringing it in.
pseudo question. So like I said, being from the rural South and not feeling like a lot of the cares and concerns of my community were reflected in environmental writing. In 2016, one of the early stories that really lit me up was looking at how some of the early cuts that the Trump administration was proposing to climate research. I wanted to see what some of the downstream implications of that would be. One of the fascinating ones I found is that the technology that the NCAA uses to forecast baseball games is inextricably tied to how NASA does climate research. That was like some of the technology they use to like, you know, figure
Wait,
out
say
like
more. What is
well,
that?
it was just basically like some of the NOAA, like the NOAA,
Yeah,
what they just like sort of one of their programs that looked at like big sets of satellite data and
yeah.
tracking. It was like primarily a weather forecasting technology, but it was also kind of climate, like, it sort of straddled both of those things, and because it was, like, at all classed as climate, the Trump administration was like, "We don't wanna put money into that, it's over," and so the NCAA had to, like, scramble to figure out how to forecast baseball games, and I was like, "That is so interesting," because that is something that, like, fair. I don't know that, like, everyone wakes up every day and is like, "Noah's budget is, like, the most important issue." Like, I'm a single issue voter, and my issue is NOAA forecasting. But, like,
Yeah.
I come from like, I really love baseball. My family are big baseball fans, go Hogs, and I was like, "This is actually really important, like, for people to know that, like, these things will have implications for their life," and, like, I think that people should care about climate for myriad reasons that have nothing to do with college baseball. But if you care about college baseball, I also want to introduce you to these other downstream impacts of um, sort of deleting huge lines in our nation's climate. So I wanted to sort of use sport as an entree for these larger climate issues. For some folks that like, the like healing curve is never exactly going to tug on their heartstrings, but maybe like understanding collegiate baseball will. And so I wanted to sort of use that as an on ramp for the community that I'm from into some of the issues that I really cared about. Like, spent some time as a sled dog reporter in rural Alaska. It was one of my first NPR jobs. And so I was living in the bush outside of Fairbanks working for NPR up there in a really weird year for sled dog racing, which is a huge sport. Like people in Alaska
Mhm.
just like everything to them. And it's this fascinating sport that's really grounded in particularly indigenous tradition, but also in like modern Alaska sport culture and transportation. And so when I was covering sled dog racing, which is a full-time job for a young NPR reporter, I was a producer on the I Did a Pod for a short time for all you sled dog fans out there. But that again was another kind of fascinating reminder of like for communities that often feel disenfranchised in the climate conversation, there always is something that is like really near and dear to people's hearts that has to do with climate. Climate touches on every aspect of the human life. I think it's just incumbent on storytellers to find those immediate connections and to sort of connect the dots between like you love baseball, amazing, here's why you need to really care about Noah's budget. Like you love sled dog racing, amazing, like you need to care that there are like when I was there, sled dogs were literally falling through the ice because it was so thin and they were having to reroute these sled dog routes. And in Alaska, one of the reasons sled dogging is still like such a thing, even in modern times, is in the winter, roads are kind of not a thing in the bush. And so people literally travel from town to town on with sled dogs or on skidoos on frozen rivers. And so when the rivers don't freeze, it makes it really, really hard for these communities to access food and to get around and see family and do all of these things. And so I thought again, it was a really fascinating sort of way that you can like in sport, which is something that a lot of
Yeah.
people really care about. It's something that I think people come to because it feels really low stakes, and yet we invest a huge amount of time and cultural energy into it. And I think that that can be a really powerful way to connect with people where they are about an issue that I think that some communities need to uh, better understand and better engage in. And I think it's also sort of a failure of environmental journalism and the environmental movement writ large to not speak to rural communities in terms that are legible to them and to like again be curious about the issues that are impactful and meaningful to those communities.
You scooped the question that I was going to ask you, which is like how effective that strategy has been of like using like sport or a pastime as an entree into sort of like the deeper, either like candidly political, but then also like political, social, and of course like environmental, economic problems. Do you think like looking back at some of your work, were there places where you went like, that, like how like specifically maybe with the running pieces, right? Because that's sort of
Mhm.
the stuff I kind of recall. Do you felt like it was working? Are there things you would have done differently looking back now in the hindsight of like 8 years or so? Well, 10 years. It's been 10
Yeah.
years, Zoe, that we've been living in this hellscape. But
Yeah.
like what like learnings you would think about now that you apply now to your
Yeah.
own work, which is kind of similar in a lot of ways, where you sort of start with this sort of like frothy, um, like I don't know, like like topical issue, but then there's really like deep stuff beneath it. Like, how do you apply it now to the work that
Yeah.
you're doing? Yeah.
I think early on as a younger person, particularly trying to make these stories, I think especially like in the trail space, the running world and the outdoor industry, there's this terrible propensity to try to individuate everything. And unfortunately, when you look at climate, individuating things is kind of the dumbest thing you can do. And inherently any story
And
that
wait,
implies
like
like
this is like the you should recycle like
yes, correct.
individuation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like recycling was something that was invented by the fossil fuel industry to assuage their guilt and launder it through the individual consumer. And those are the stories that often feel more palatable in the
Yeah.
outdoor industry because it doesn't make it so that people have to question systems that are profiting off of their guilt. It makes it so that people don't have to question or examine their consumption habits. And so early on, I think some of my writing, because I was trying to find a way to shoehorn it into the trail world, into the running industry, was like, check out this shoe. The eyelet on the shoelace is made out of 90% recycled materials. And it's these things that, like, two things can be true.
Yeah.
We should pull on every lever we have any action is better than none action, and there is some increasing research that shows that things like that, things like focusing on cupless events, focusing on gel wrappers, can actually end up distracting from the larger scale systemic and policy things that we need. It's sort of like the straw conundrum. As a Californian, you can probably relate deeply to this idea that we can sometimes get really married to these really small solutions, even on a policy level of like, well, let's ban plastic straws rather than let's overhaul the farm bill. Let's hold the largest polluters accountable. Let's actually elect people who are interested in pulling on the bigger levers so that I don't have to think about plastic straws ever again. And I think in the outdoor industry, particularly running, because you will sound insane and you will not land pitches if all of your writing ends up being like, here's what runners should do for the environment. And it's just policy that doesn't feel super specific to being a runner. Even though that policy is the stuff that genuinely has the chance to move the needle, the outdoor industry, because it always is like really fixated on putting its own sort of lens on things, making it feel really relevant to the identity of being a runner, tends to inadvertently or advertently incentivize these solutions that just have less meaning. And I think that they can be helpful if they invite people into the conversation, and they can serve as distractions that again allow us to have warm fuzzies because we recycled the gel wrapper and yet we don't vote in midterms. It allows us to feel good because we bought a shoe with a recycled eyelet and I don't have to look at my larger consumption patterns that actually, again, might move the needle on things. And so early on, I think I was a little happier to play ball and be like, sure, I'll write a roundup of like green gear. Whereas like
Right.
now I don't do that because they're the only sustainable gear is the gear you already have, full stop. Like don't buy, you cannot buy a thing and
Yeah.
call it sustainable.
Yeah, there was a really interesting, really long, but really interesting Substack. I'm throwing the link in the chat. Oh my gosh, that is such a messy URL. But it's from, I don't know who this is. It's Trails and
Mm,
Ultras NC is the writer, but they
mm,
wrote this sort of like kind of like punchy provocative piece about like trail running not being an environmental sport. And it's essentially that. But like, like we went cupless, right? But like their criticism, and I think this is like a smart one, although it's like hedged a lot because they don't want to be like, it's not bad that you're doing the stuff, but like it's like deep beneath it. And I think their argument in this like pretty long piece is that there's the problem is more the market logic that so
mm.
many like trail running organizations, whether they are or it's like a shoe company or whether it's, I mean, they're taking like a little bit more focus on like trail racing series like UTMB, which has like a carbon offset program now for folks who are flying in. But the whole
Yeah.
point is, right, like that you don't have to feel bad about the fact that you are flying over the Atlantic to go hang out in this like basically nice resort in in the middle of the Alps, and you go for your like nice little like self-actualizing like 100-mile race around the mountains that like, but there were no cups were
Yeah.
harmed. But like you flew all the way there, and like the carbon offset is this like sort of like strange thing. And so like the market though, in fact, is like it's predicated upon growth, right? And it's like what UTMB is trying to do is like make UTMB bigger and have there be UTMBs everywhere, and like, but that logic is just one that is based upon using the environment as a resource, and then tactics to sort of like mitigate some of the effects of that. But ultimately, it's not much different than any company, right, that's trying to grow. Like when the
Yeah.
whole point is like just like line go up, right? And that's
Yeah.
the same
Order
logic.
over
That's
order growth. Exactly what
yeah,
our environment loves and needs.
yeah, that's right. And ROI. And so and like and look, I work for a big company and I sort of know this logic and like am very well enmeshed in it. And like it's sort of the water that we're drinking that we live in. But I think that's a provocative point. It's like
Yeah.
your
So
shoes being made out of like 25% recyclable material is not the issue.
right, like, that's just, like I mean, we could, like obviously, running shoes could be more sustainable, and if we managed to perfect that tomorrow, like, it would not functionally change the trajectory we're on. So, this was actually a really specific question I was interested in researching, and I wrote a piece for, like, The Wind magazine about this, about the fact that so many of the actions that races specifically try to take individuate things rather than looking at, like, the biggest carbon emissions associated with racing is the travel, and yet very few races attempt to do anything to mitigate that. And I really wanted to look at the research. And I mean, unfortunately, it's pretty muddy. And I walked away. I feel like this is a good piece because I walked away just kind of like, huh, I don't know what I
Mhm,
think. It's really complicated. And like,
mhm,
obviously, sociological research is hella messy. Observational studies are the best tool we have and yet still pretty imperfect. But there's some research that actually found fascinating for me in looking at the behavior of trail runners. Many trail runners specified environmentalism as a primary value for themselves, and yet far and away could not name how that actually shifted their behavior. So there is this sort of thing of like, we all say this is something that we care about a lot, and yet it's not really mirrored in our actions. There was also research that showed that some of these smaller, like the cupless races and like offsets can actually act as a permission structure so that you're like, well, I mean, it's a cupless race, so it's environmentally friendly. So I'm gonna ball out and like fly there and like do like engage in all of these other more carbon intensive behaviors because you've created this permission structure where you've allowed yourself to not engage with the reality, the extractive reality of what we're doing. And I'm not here saying like we should never do races. Like I do a UTMB race a year because I love going to Europe and eating pasta and running in the Alps or the Chianti Hills. And yet, so many of the actions I think end up being really imperfect. Like, on one hand, I do think race organizers have an obligation to try to do their best. And yet, so many of the things that they're actually capable of doing, like, what we need to do is invent like a better jet fuel. We need better transportation infrastructure, and
yeah,
particularly like at the UTMB World Series, they have incentives for taking public transit, which is all well and good. But I live in rural Colorado and cannot take. There's like maybe one ultra that
yeah,
I could literally take public transit to, and so like beating myself up over that maybe isn't the most useful, but letting myself off the hook and then not engaging or not trying to find those bigger levers I can pull on, which in the US more often than not, I think ends up being policy, both on the state, regional, and national level. So I think that it's complicated. The research is very mixed on like, can these things end up being distracting? Yes. There's maybe some smaller, again, observational studies that show that they might act as like educational tools, like for people that have zero
mhm,
environmental context, don't think of themselves as environmentalist. If you engage them on the level of like, well, the bib is recyclable, that might help them. That can be like a first touch point where they're like, "Oh, okay, the environment is important."
there's a
I'm a little
problem
less
here.
that
Yeah,
because at this point, if like recyclable bibs is what convinces you that like human dignity is worth fighting for and we should not let people in Bangladesh die, like I just
yeah.
don't have a ton that I feel like we have in common.
Yeah. There's, like, a part of me that has always thought a little bit about, like, I just wish we could just be honest, which is like, "I just wanna grow this race." And, like, that would
Yeah.
be almost in like, more like, straightforward or at least transparent, but it in because to a certain extent, I think, like, at its worst, right, it becomes sort of like Instagram marketing, where it's like, it's
Yeah.
you're just marketing to a particular form of, like, cleaner consumption, right, that, like, appeals to a certain sort of like, it's I mean, greenwashing, I guess, is another way of putting it,
Yeah, it's
right?
like
Yeah.
clean coal. It's just like still coal, man.
Yeah, yeah,
You can't put
yeah. So
green or sustainable on it. Like the
yeah,
facts are what it is, and I think you're insofar that we're not honest about the real objectives, we can't be honest enough to actually change the incentives that can meaningfully move the needle in the marketplace. And also,
yeah,
I'm skeptical of the marketplace being the end all be all of climate solutions. I think it's obviously a huge lever that we can pull on, and I don't think we pull on it quite enough. But yeah, like you said, if we're not honest about it and honest about the things that cause people to make these decisions, then it's going to be really hard to actually like rise to the level of the challenge we're facing.
yeah, yeah. I really appreciate your thoughts, and we spent all this time we haven't talked about food, so let's talk about food.
No, yeah,
So, but this is a great segue because, like, this is, like, so much about, like, your broader background and interests, and I'm really curious, like, how you got into the subject of, like, diet culture or just, I guess, food more
yeah,
generally. I think of, like,
yeah,
Your Diet Sucks as being, like, very focused on, I 'cause I'm interested in the culture piece of this, but you have actual you bring science to the work more generally. But
yeah,
how food? You got into food, and how
yeah.
old is the podcast now?
It's a little over 2 years old, yeah.
Yeah.
So I started it it would have been the spring of 2024, and so, like, my actual specific master's degree was in environmental journalism with a focus in food system solutions, so looking at climate through a food systems perspective, and food, kind of similar to sport for me, and maybe even more so, is something that touches on all the fascinating aspects of being a human. Food is culture, food is science, food is biology, food is politics, food is religion, food is all of these things. And yet sometimes it can be really hard for us because it's all so tied up in it, like all of these really complicated and sophisticated decisions that we as people engaged in food culture end up making on a daily basis. It can be hard to disentangle those. And so having worked at like Outside Magazine for years and sort of bouncing around the like outdoor health, wellness, fitness space, as a journalist with a background in science communications, I feel like having seen where the sausage got made, I became really interested, particularly in how when you refract science through the prism that is social media, through sort of like pop science writing, through fitness media, the thing that the other side is almost unrecognizable. And I've always been interested in the way that, particularly as athletes, we tend to think of ourselves as like very rational and like food is just fuel and I'm just trying to hit my macros. And yet, when you actually dig into the science, it becomes extremely obvious that the decisions we're making are so much more premised on feelings and beliefs and than science, which is not bad. I think that is a feature, not a bug. Like we are culture is like what makes us, who we are. And so I've always just been so fascinated at disentangling the science from the culture, looking at what ends up guiding our beliefs and guiding our behaviors and trying to sort of disentangle all of these things and sort of bringing my own personal experience as both a journalist and researcher and someone passionate about science communication, and as someone who's been in eating disorder recovery for about a decade. I thought I had a pretty interesting and specific lens to bring to it. And typically, as a journalist, I don't bring my first person experience and I'm reporting through the guise of objectivity. But one of the fascinating things about podcasting and sort of the new media that is increasingly what people turn to is that you can bring in that firsthand experience and sort of use it to enhance the storytelling rather than detract from it.
Yeah. I mean, even the notion of like from where you were starting, like with the athletes of like food being fuel is itself like a metaphor that it was created in a specific like time and place of like that notion that like the content of what you eat is just like a flat set of like calories that can be burned out is like it's I did a little bit of work on or read a little bit about some of this stuff like in the 17th century when I was working on my dissertation where like there are like different notions of the understanding of like food having like a sort of humoral effect, right? In the Middle Ages, or some sort of, or even like a vitalist notion of it, like that it might linger and sort of like penetrate you in ways and like shape your mood and systems, which is very different from the notion of just like it's flat calories and or like contributes into these different like macronutrient pillars, and then those have like set tasks, and all of that is like not true. Like, not
I
yeah,
actually feel like they almost converge maybe even more than unite. No, it's like there's this idea now of nutrition, which is the idea that we can just distill food down to its nutritional contents and that that's the most honest way to understand food. This is, of course, not how experts view food. It's typically how people who like pseudo expert, like the sort of like online commentariat
yeah,
tends to view food, how the media tends to view food. And this comes up in things like 5 foods to boost your metabolism. It's like, well, you can't really boost your metabolism, and also that's not how food works. Like,
yeah,
none of these things work in isolation. Like, food is greater than the sum of its component parts. And so, but so much of it gets sort of cast as like, if you need more magnesium, just eat more pumpkin seeds. And so you have people that'll end up like eating a ton of pumpkin seeds for this like really short term, and it doesn't actually change things because what diet is like a sustained pattern of eating for the long haul, not just like if you can throw chia on your next,
yeah,
breakfast parfait. But athletes really tend to have this understanding of food is just like its nutritional components. And we try to strip away the culture. And we try to strip away narrative and belief, and you actually can't. And that's actually not a more like it seems superficially like a more scientific way of understanding things of like It's just the omegas and the vitamin C. And in fact, food, the way that you can't separate it from the culture, you can't separate it from the political, and so there's in the attempt to try to take our sort of, like, laboratory understanding of food and translate it to the real world, there's a huge gap there that actual experts and actual researchers recognize, but the sort of cottage industry of, like, influencers and, like, diet gurus end up filling in that gap with beliefs that are a gross oversimplification of the way that nutrition and food and its parts interact with the human body.
Yeah, and so, like, we were chatting about this specifically on the athlete valence a little bit, like, shopping emails around, like, athletes being, like, are athletes more or less vulnerable to these sorts of, like, food myths? And is it because, like, when we're thinking like that lens you were saying that athletes want to take a sort of a laboratory lens, and yet there's, like, so much marketed to athletes, which leads you to believe that actually maybe that's not the case, that we're just as vulnerable to magical thinking as anyone else. Is it just that, like, we're trying to get performance gains? Because I know a lot of people who don't, like, they're not thinking about the food they eat necessarily, like, they're not, or that they don't approach their own running necessarily, like, they're not trying to, like, most, I think, like, probably a majority of runners, while they might have performance goals in mind, they're not trying to be Eliud Kipchoge, or they don't care if they win or not, right? Like, a lot of folks come to the sport, especially in trail running, but even beyond that, like, with many motives beyond just, like, competitive edge. And yet there's lots of food that's marketed to help and sustain that. And are we, so, like, whether the vulnerability of athletes, does
Yes.
it come from that? I can't just be like, I just want to get, like, the 1%, 2%
Yeah.
gains, like,
No,
yeah.
you're totally right, and I think, there to go to the science, there isn't specific research on athletes and bad diet beliefs, but there is on athletes and pseudoscience, and so
Yeah.
there was a study out of the UK that found that, like, on average, elite athletes actually were slightly more, had, like, indexed slightly higher than the general population on pseudoscientific beliefs, and so although that was, it's an observational study, so it can't quite show that, like, it's caused by,
Mhm.
like, it's not like being an athlete might cause these things, it just shows that they're correlated. I feel that a lot of times it goes to exactly what you said with, like, a vulnerability, and so usually people become susceptible to pseudoscience and misinformation when there is a vulnerability or a gap between where they are and where they wanna be. So for
Mm.
athletes, that kind of inherently creates that gap of vulnerability of, like,
Mhm.
"I'm here, here's where I wanna be." Even if
Mhm.
where you wanna Eliud Kipchoge, I mean, think about how many Americans wanna be 3 to 5 pounds lighter. Think about
Mhm.
how many Americans wanna, maybe podium in their age group or just wanna finish their first ultra, their first marathon or whatever it is, or look better, in a swimsuit or whatever, like, sort of bullshit thing that culture has told us of, like, you'll be happy when XYZ. And we're also putting a huge demand on our bodies, and we identify with this identity but it's like a precarious identification. Like, people are always, always, always trying to, like, be more of an athlete and trying to close that gap. And so, insert some magnesium supplement that's like, to be an athlete, you must take this, or like, this will give you an edge. And so, even if you're not trying to be Kipchoge, everyone is trying to optimize. And it's extremely alluring to believe that there's always some supplement, some pill, some ketone you can take that will have an outsized impact in your life, because the reality is that athletics is kind of chaotic. We're all living in aging human bodies that are extremely unruly, especially folks from, like, uh in bodies that have been, like, historically marginalized by culture. That creates even more vulnerability for people to sell and pitch into. And people, uh it just becomes extremely compelling that there's, like, some small thing that you are inherently missing, and that is what makes supplements, these, like, kind of hacky protocols, intermittent fasting, keto, paleo, like, non like, diets that don't have any medical underpinning and, like, are primarily, like, based on a really shoddy body of pseudoscience and, like, a total misunderstanding of evolutionary biology. It creates this, way for people to perform and like, reassert their identities to themselves and to try to wrest control back into their sphere of influence, away from age, away from time, away from the fact that many people are overworked and underslept and have poor stress management. And so given that, it's really tempting to believe that if you just buy this pill or have this powder, or this shot, or whatever it is, it will enable you to finally assert control over your physical body in a way that somehow you just haven't been able to prior.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So it's not so much necessarily around the competitive edge, but it is like there's this like very deep American, not American, but like feels kind of American, like notion of like
Americans.
yeah, an aspirational gap of like you're here and you want to be here, and maybe that gap has been sold to you, perhaps, but it might be like a legitimate like I want to be able to run a marathon, or I, want to feel better in my body. But there's sort of you're here, you're in one place and you're in another. And then like food can be the vehicle with which you move from
Yeah.
between those 2 points. Yeah. I also wonder too, like, and here I'm curious for your thoughts because I think we're in this moment too, in addition to that, like I'm like the marketing to the gap, right? There's also in the air right now this notion of like enhancement more generally, which
Mhm.
is a little bit different metaphor than this like you're like you want I mean, maybe it is actually just like old wine in a new bottle. But there's like, there are the enhanced games now, which are these like full stop. Just take things as long as well, actually, was an interesting podcast in the New York Times on Ross Douthat's podcast with like one of the guys who did the enhanced games, and apparently it's not just all illegal stuff. They're following FDA
Well,
regulations.
that's the thing that is so I'm so obsessed with the enhanced games
Yeah,
because the bizarre I mean, the totally predictable plot twist is that it's mostly just, like, a racket to end up selling supplements, duh, and they actually ended up doing even more testing and even more control and having, like, as many regulations as WADA and USADA because so many of these, like, banned substances, they're not just banned because they give you an edge, they're banned because they make your heart stop when you
they could kill
exercise.
you. Yeah,
They have these crazy downstream impacts that mean that these people have to be in constant communication with doctors, doing constant drug tests. Some of the professional swimmers ended up gaining so much muscle mass that they were no longer sufficiently buoyant to compete at the elite level. It ended up slowing them down because being extremely ripped creates hella drag. And then they weren't able to even fit into the swimsuits that would render them competitive in the first place. So it's this fascinating case study in doing all of these things to get an edge actually ended up, like, really not giving a lot of these folks an edge, and so there were a couple people that, like, yes, I guess theoretically did end up breaking what would have been seen as the world record, but it's unsanctioned and obviously not
yeah.
recognized because cheating, but in their attempt to subvert the established rules, they basically just ended up recreating an entirely different universe that abided by its own set of rules and strictures that was just as encumbered as the one that they had tried to escape.
That's incredible. That's incredible. And I think too that there is this like I've been thinking of this as like all part of like a broader gestalt, and like it is like that AI is part of this, particularly in terms of like AI as it relates to the way people are using it for either like work or
Mm.
sports and things like that, where they're thinking of it as like just one more. I mean, the metaphor that like a lot of like corporate middle managers will use to like their own like direct reports being the recipient of some of this information is like it's like the Iron Man suit that you can put on. It's like Tony Stark is still a genius, but Tony Stark has the Iron Man suit now, so he's like can 10x himself in ways that like and he could fly and like you couldn't fly. So like think of these tools as like that. And it's always like and I think like that like enhancement, I think about that too with like increasing number of like personal vehicles that have batteries attached to them as well. Of like, and I because I and my personal story here, like this will get to a point at some point. But is like I was at a playground with my daughter in North Carolina, and I saw these like 5-year-old boys flying around this playground in these bikes, and they were just electric bikes, and they were going like 30 miles an hour on these
They're I
bikes.
mean, they are small
You're
motorcycles,
small
like
motorcycles. Yeah, and at first I was like, "Oh my gosh, please wear a helmet." But the other part was like, "You're not riding a bike though either. Like you're not riding the bike." And it made me a little bit worried about like, "Oh gosh, like they're not like learning how to ride bikes." And then but so all of that is to make me think that I feel like some of this stuff around like enhancement as a metaphor is connected to like there's something there around a pressure that we're putting on ourselves from just the moment in which we live in with certain technologies that are there. But then there's like this permission structure that's beginning to be created by
Mm.
like folks like the architects of the enhanced game. And even if they are creating like a different regular schema around it, um, they're like, I think there's a lot more people now that are like, I'm very interested in the use of like testosterone in a
Yeah.
way that like they never would have been 10 years ago. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if that spurs any thoughts.
No, I mean, I think that, like, the optimization to the detriment of actual well-being is fascinating, and, like, there's so many ways this comes up of, like and this is something that when you look at the research, like, particularly men are susceptible to because, again, a lot of the ways that this stuff functions on a gender level is, like, to sell things to women, you, like, just put the word skinny on it, and, like, to sell things to dudes, you put the word, like, tactical on it, and you, like, make it a biohacking
I
thing.
literally bought deodorant for that reason.
Yeah, it's like, I've got my face wipes have to be tactical because 'cause I'm a man, and that's what I need as, like, a guy that, works in the tech industry, like,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's, like, sort of plays on this idea that, like, men have been socialized to think of themselves primarily as just, like, producers and, like,
Mhm.
bringers home of the bacon, so you make them feel insecure about it, and then you pitch into that insecurity, and I think there's also this, like, consistent I mean, regardless of gender, this feeling that so many of us, like, constantly have more and more drains on our time and energy, more and more things that are sort of, like, pulling us in different directions at all times, and that there must be, like, one answer to it of, like, maybe if I can just cold plunge, then I'll finally be able to show up to work and get everything done in a day before I have to go home and be dad, or, like, if I can just, take this peptide, then finally, like, I'll heal my back and be able to, like,
Yeah.
write a book and, like, go be the weekend warrior that I want to be on the weekends, and this idea that there's, like, one missing thing that will unlock all of these other things, but what you see is that people end up chasing these, like, extremely marginal gains that might have, like, a mechanistic underlying, like, technically, yes, they might in a laboratory do a thing. But for many people, so many of these interventions, like these biohack type interventions of like taking off label metformin and cold plunging and saunaing and, you know, intermittent fasting and not eating carbs and like all of these kind of extreme
Yeah.
interventions that end up like being a real drain on your resources, your time, your money, your energy. They don't end up advancing people quite as much as one might think, and if you are not sleeping enough, if you are not eating a well-rounded, balanced diet and getting in the energy you need, if you are not like connected to community, like doing all these things that we like, the evidence is not mixed on
Yeah.
if those things are good for you. Like, we know they're good for you. But so many times people end up focusing on these really marginal interventions to the detriment of those big percentages of just living like a meaningful and connected life and eating enough and sleeping enough and trying to manage stress where you can. And I think there's a world where like continuing to buy and intentionally buy, like they are on offer because it's really hard to monetize community and sleep, though not impossible. We are giving it our best shot. It's very easy to monetize these other interventions because it can be bottled and pilled and sold in a shot or in like a one-on-one coaching program that you get online, and it just makes it makes it so that people feel that they can buy out of the chaos. They can buy this like more optimized version of themselves and not have to think about the like kind of hard to manage stuff, the stuff that like, without doing a lot more deeper reflection of our culture and like capitalist system at large, like the reason a lot of people aren't sleeping is because life is hard and chaotic and we have huge drains on our time and resources. It's not because they need some like magnesium harvested from an Icelandic alpine pool.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that that there's anxiety that's running. I
Yeah.
mean, there's always an anxiety, right? Some sort of, but I think particularly like I'm now in the belly of the beast in Silicon Valley in the company that I work at. I work for Google. And so like I'm in this, right? There's nowhere like more that these like pressures are, and specifically in like a large corporate environment. And I think that there's like this like there's a lot of the pressure is like around like being replaced, being
Mm,
having to like retool in real time, and like how you do your work, whatever your function is. If you're a software engineer, Claude Code can do that job from like an entry level like perspective. Like you don't have to have someone do a lot of work that used to be very, very human centered, is very automated. I think that's like where a lot of it I think there's just this sort of like economic precarity that we've been living in
Yeah.
since 2008 that drives a lot of that interest in some of these supplements. And to your point, like it, community being the thing that often is the sort of like both the foundation and then also the way in which you can like get to that next place is really hard to build. As you were talking, I was thinking I've been meaning to write like a piece about like that the most like the best performance enhancing drug you could ever get would be to be on a team. Like I think
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
social obligations, like the notion that people are depending on you for your performance is so much more powerful than lion's mane would ever do, however many
Yeah.
you could take
Yeah.
of the pills. Just the notion that like people you care about are reliant on you for something. And what then that could be in a work context and I think in an athletic like context, it
Yeah.
is it is just like a superpower. I think about like my own like running performances, and I can think of like my top 3 or 4 where I was like, I never ran harder. Like I never worked harder than in that moment, and they're all team contexts.
Yeah.
And I just realized like I, 'cause I think at my senior conference cross country meet, it wasn't my best race by any means, but it was definitely like the hardest I've ever worked. Like my ears rang for like an hour afterward. It was probably good. I was so wrecked because I was coming off an injury. Sorry to go story time here my senior year, this was at Chattanooga, Tennessee, 2006 Southern Conference Championships. I was like had very little like foundational training. But it was your senior year and had all these like you know teammates who were sort of relying on like being my getting my body ahead of my competitors. And I should have finished like 30th, and I finished like I think 13th, and I got just destroyed afterwards. But it was I was in tears at the end of it, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like, and I remember being in there. I was like, everyone on this team is relying on me to get through this, and it didn't at all involve ketones.
Right. Well, I mean,
Yeah,
that's like when you look at the evidence, like, I mean, this is validated in so much research. And it's like so often, like now that I'm a person in the online fitness, like I'll get
yeah,
tons of emails like, what's the best exercise? Or like, what's the best exercise to burn calories? And it's like, whatever you like. And also, the
mm,
point of exercise isn't always inherently to burn calories. So I would question every aspect of that premise. But like so many times people are like, I'm trying to optimize and like, I want to find like the best calorie burn or like the best exercise for longevity. And it's like, yeah, go play pickup basketball with your guys. Like whatever will help you come back and enjoy it. That is genuinely the X factor. Like that is actually what makes these things helpful and productive. Like that is the sort of thing that really moves the needle rather than like, well, actually, if you swim with a weight vest, that'll be the best way. Like people always are trying to optimize to the detriment of the things that like can actually have an impact in their lives. And again, it's much harder to sell someone like true community than it is to sell them a weight vest or a training plan.
yeah, yeah. Totally agree. I'm gonna push us in a slightly different direction. But before I do, I want to say thank you to everyone who's watching us live, and for being here and getting ready for your World Cup
Woo!
game for the
USA.
U.S. We got to beat. I mean, they're called the Socceroos. I mean, I just
Yeah,
can't take the Australian national team
or
seriously
golden
for that
in
reason.
being Socceroos. It's tough,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah. Thanks all for being here. If you have a question, feel free to throw it in the chat and we will try to answer it. But I wanted to say like that there's a tension though, right? Like I've been sort of steering us talking about like enhancement and supplementation. But the vibes are also kind of like back to earth in a lot of ways. We're in this
Mm,
like make America healthy again, which is sort of a like return of sorts. So like there's a lot of tensions on in American like culture and politics right now, obviously, even within the Trump administration, between like this like brave new techno future and versus like some sort of return to I don't know like traditional life and with like the end of no fault divorce and stuff like that. But what do you think is like the most charitable version of the
mm,
Make America Healthy Again food critique? Like there's a core there that's very bipartisan, right? Like a
yeah.
lot of this emerged from like Marin County here and like the West Coast and Berkeley Bowl kind of ethos. But how would you take that criticism seriously? Like, is there
Mm.
something there? Or is it all just
Oh,
kind of
n I
like,
mean, for sure. I think it actually does sort of locate a really, I think, a true feeling that I think many Americans have of like, if you I don't think anyone looks around and is like, "Yeah, we're healthy and thriving." Like, people know. And
Mhm.
our political system has really not done anything serious to talk about it. Like, there has not been a major presidential candidate to really talk about our food system in a meaningful way. But that's a huge part of people's lives. Most of us eat 3 times a day. And so it's crazy that this huge part of our experience and of what we know is like not going amazing in our country is just totally unaddressed by like the mainstream political spectrum. And so into that gap come these people, a lot of them grifters. Some people I think are really well intentioned, but maybe have just found a solution that I would quabble with because I think like I don't know,
Yeah.
letting people buy CGMs with like HSA money is way less important than just like fixing food deserts and just
Wait,
like
what's a CGM? I don't know CGM.
uh, continuous glucose monitor. So this is like a big thing that RFK is into is like obviously we should all eat natural, but also
Avoiding
buy
like the spikes
a
and like
transdermal pack that yeah, so that
yeah,
we all can monitor our blood sugar at all times, despite a lack of evidence that that helps healthy people. And so it's I think again, like it locates a real concern and it locates a concern that mainstream politics has not taken seriously. And it makes people feel crazy of sitting in that cognitive dissonance of like, it's so hard to eat healthy. Our food system is clearly effed. Our like health and thriving is clearly effed. And so the very first person that comes along and actually authentically speaks to those concerns, unfortunately ends up getting to be the person that sucks a lot of oxygen out of the room. And it sort of creates this like horseshoe of like, I mean, and like weirdly, they meet in the middle on like things like peptides, like RFK is hugely into these, like, despite the sort of like all natural, like no
yeah,
processed thing, like, I guess it's cool to inject gray market Chinese peptides that are fully unregulated, but it, like, is sort of this, like, like, again, I think it's very fair to have critiques of our food system and very fair to have critiques of the FDA and USDA. I don't know that the solution is CGMs and Chinese peptides, but it sort of also becomes this thing of, hyper individuating the response rather than like, oh, I'm in charge of, health and human services. I am in charge of the FDA. I can actually meaningfully pass policy at scale to address these issues. It's like, let's talk about CGMs and let's talk about like ibogaine and trying to end the war on protein and peptides and creating a food pyramid where grapes and butter sit side by side. And it is sort of this, I think it's a poor response to a complete abdication on the part of American political figures to take seriously something that I think does weigh heavily on folks, and unfortunately, it just means that the first people to clear their throats and speak up sort of get to dictate where the conversation goes, and a lot of those folks are not guided by science, they're not guided by a compassionate understanding of why people actually make the decisions that they do. They don't seem very interested in changing incentive structures and policy. They seem really interested in like for people that love to critique big pharma, they seem extremely excited to also sell like unregulated supplements that like that's a huge industry too, guys. Like just because
yeah.
it's not controlled by the FDA in the same way doesn't, mean that they're off the hook. In fact, I think it's even more suspicious. And so it just sort of creates this scenario where the loudest person in the room kind of gets to dictate what the conversation ends up being.
I'm gonna struggle to ask this question that I thought of as you were replying there. But I'll do my best. And that is around like I think like one of the things that I see there is like very much like on the right now, or it's like populism more generally, right? Because on the far left too is this sort of a critique of like institutions more generally, right? And so like on the left, it's a critique of like economic institutions, economic structures, right? Like the market as we ourselves were critiquing it, right? And on the right, the market with a T and a capital T, capital M, right? Like it's like so we ourselves make our like I myself make our like the lazy critiques in that way. And on the right, it's like it's a critique of like institutions that like NOAA, right? Like actually no, your Weather Channel app is just the interface on these like deep institutional like the reason
Yeah.
why it is a storm is because you've got like these very like deeply embedded that well institutions that took a lot of time and care to and effort and money and resources to assemble that on the right they're like sort of slashing it down because it's like it creates policies that they think they disagree with um and so all that's to say is like there's a critique of those of like institutions more generally, right? um and I'm curious about how you think about this in regards to your own podcast. because I think a lot of the work that you do is like kind of similar, right? Like you're making a
Mm.
historical critique. I don't, they're not necessarily like always aimed at the FDA, right? But there's sort of a like, uh, there's like a similar structure to like the critique that like it's a similar I don't wanna say it's the same thing. It's like the similar, like, form of criticism, which is like, "Oh, like, the FDA was, like, actually, like, made by, like, these guys who were, like, in the pocket of, like, like, weird, like, guys who, like, wanted you to, like, eat cereal so that you wouldn't masturbate." Like, so like, they're doing that same critique, which is not too dissimilar from, like, the work that you do. Of course, you're like, you then you will ground yours in science, and they'll just be like, "And now you should this is why you should, like, buy this
Right,
supplement."
yeah.
Right,
That's why you
right?
should buy my no-fap cereal instead.
Yes, exactly, yeah, 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 which is just like raw meat.
Yeah, it's just
Um,
meat cereal.
it's just meat, it's just meat. Have you seen the SNL sketch on, like, Maha General Hospital, which is like,
Yes.
patients
Oh,
come
good.
in, they're like, "Oh my god." He's like, "You got a car." He's like, "What does he?" "He needs steak."
Yeah,
I need 38 kilograms of, like, filet mignon on this guy right now. Anyway, all that to say is, like, does that question make sense around, like, there's, like, a criticism of it's like a
mm,
not necessarily, like, historically rooted criticism in a lot of your work. You balance it by trying to take a step back not step back, but, like, you trying to balance it with, like, here is what evidence-backed science brings, and you're trying to merge those together. I
yeah,
think and I think some people on the right might push back on this and say, like, "We do this in different ways too." I feel like a lot of those critiques are like, "Hey, like, look, we found this, there's a history here, right? Like, people were making decisions and they were kind of wrong, and, like, when you unpack it, it's, like, not right, so maybe that's why we should question these institutions." Um, do you see similarities there? Is it, between the criticism
yeah,
of what
yeah, I
you're
think
doing?
I mean, it is tough because I feel like there's always this propensity of, like, we always wanna be really diligent, not making sure that we're just, like, we like all the systems that our team likes, and we critique the systems that, like, don't fit my priors, and
Yeah.
so, for me, that's one of the reasons why going back to both the culture and the science is so helpful because we don't make these decisions in a vacuum. I recognize that if unchecked, a lot of my critiques would basically just be reasserting my previously held beliefs and identities in the world, and so, whenever you sort of pull on the thread of history, it helps you sort of get the closest as close to a blank slate as possible, like with the FDA specifically. It was actually created by like 8 dudes who were poisoning their colleagues for science in like the White House cafeteria, which is even better and even an incredible origin story. And also The Jungle from Upton Sinclair. And so trying to
Mhm.
see like where did these things come from? How much of that gave rise to the critiques we have today? And trying to like shave off like whatever cultural and narrative baggage I'm bringing to it. So I can get as close to that blank slate as possible. And I think that it is tough because, yeah, you just don't wanna be the person who's like, "And here's 90 minutes of why I have been right this whole time." I think for me, I get the most obsessed about our Your Diet Sucks episodes where I realize I'm wrong
Mhm.
about something,
Mhm.
or I have a mistaken belief, or something is a little bit different and more complicated than I thought it would be. And so I think that so often I feel like the best science, the best research, the best cultural analysis ends up leading you to a place where, like, yes, we often do have institutional critiques, and then there's also this feeling of, like, "And I don't totally know how to fix it," or, like, and here is, like, where that sort of, like how these things get kind of just, like it sort of becomes cultural telephone and trying to figure out what as close to the original message was as possible, and so, I think that for us, one of the challenges is that a big part of the project of our show is trying to dismantle the sort of meta narrative we have around these things, trying to like shave off that big stuff to get down to the essence. But it is really like that sort of is the DNA of what we're doing is like the sort of baggage and the preconceived notions that we have, and really just trying to um eliminate our priors to actually like answer a real question. But I think that the challenge is that most of these things end up being way more complicated than one might imagine, and, like, usually I'm left with the feeling of, like, "Oh, actually, maybe the other camp was, like, a little more right about this than I thought,"
Mhm.
or again, like, they've located a real concern or a real desire, and we haven't spoken to that, and so this is maybe not the most articulate answer, but usually we sort of get deposited on the shores of like a big shrug. And that's where I kind of end up being the happiest as a journalist.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that resonates. I almost all of like my like pseudo historical writing ends up with ambivalence, kind of being
Yeah,
like
yeah,
the default.
yeah,
Not ambivalence, but like I don't know.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
and yeah,
Yes. It's all
yeah,
very like, again, like I feel like it's funny because like I always like to name our episodes after questions, and I feel like the rule of journalism is anytime you ask a question and the headlined answer is just like almost always no, like, but it helps, invite people in, and more often than not, and I think this is it mirrors good science in this way of you're left with more questions than answers. And so often I think the people who are rushing to give answers rather
yes,
than sit in the critique and sit in the criticism end up being the bad actors, because I think so much bad diet and health advice happens when we end up trying to be prescriptive and we get out over our evidentiary skis and trying to like again individuate these things and make it like give everything a pithy takeaway and a checklist and like something that you can think about when you go to the grocery store today, rather than just sitting with the fact that like, why do these like weird old cereal guys still guide so much of my inner world?
yeah. That resonates so much. We are drowning in answers. We are drowning in
Yes,
answers, and we need more questions.
exactly.
Especially like I mean, like you're getting answers from people. You're getting answers from automated systems. You get so
Yeah,
many answers. We don't give any questions. I think that that
yeah,
really resonates, and I think we need to figure out ways with media of creating spaces and cultures so that folks can ask more questions.
yeah,
It
and
seems like it.
incentivizing
Yeah.
uncertainty, right? Like, it's very hard to become successful when your whole thing is like, "I don't know, it's complicated. Here's 90 minutes of 2 women talking about studies," and so, I think
Yeah.
that as human, like, understanding that psychological like, we crave certainty, we crave answers. People don't wanna know the science as much as they think they do, they wanna know how to, like, make decisions more efficiently. Everyone's looking for a heuristic, whether they recognize it or not. And so I think that trying to just be aware of our biases and be aware of the mental shortcuts where we're taking is probably the best way to get more comfortable with sitting in that place of like, actually, a lot of times our search for definitive answers and our search for certainty is what sort of ends up driving us into the arms of bad actors and away from the nuance and the beautiful complexity that I think ends up being something that has like the genuine opportunity to bring people together even more.
Yeah, yeah. I want to start moving us towards wrapping up a little bit because I'm thinking about the time that I was on a it's so funny like a like ketone startups like podcast, and we chatted for 3.5 hours. It was like very
Oh my
Joe
god.
Rogan. I was like, this is the life. I was like, I need to get lunch. Like how long are we gonna talk? I don't want to do that. So,
I'm
but I
bonking.
I'm really interested in like what you're thinking about right now. Like, what are some of the
Mm,
I don't know. I don't want to. You need necessarily like give any teasers on like some upcoming podcast, but what are some problems or challenges with food culture or diet
mm.
culture otherwise that you're thinking about a lot right now that you're interested in like or and can't wait to share with your listeners and readers?
Yeah, so I just finished reporting on an episode about peptides and then one about microplastics, and
Mm,
they're pretty different topics, but I feel like they're sort of again located in this fascinating like athletes meets Maha moms part of the internet. And I think again, both of those are a case of like, I mean, particularly with microplastics, of like there's some there. Like this isn't, it's not like the paleo diet where it's like this is totally made up. There's no here. I
yeah,
just want to dunk on this podcast, like dunk on this dumb diet and have a good time. Like with microplastics, there is some interesting and complicated and unresolved science that I do think some people should be thinking about. And there are some things that almost can be prescriptions. And, also with peptides. There's some really fascinating science there. Not nearly to the point where I, again, a lady with a poetry degree, would feel comfortable giving anything close to a prescription. But there are these areas where it's like, man, there's some interesting stuff here and there's some excitement here. And there's some threads that I do want to keep pulling on, but it's still really early. And so as a journalist, I'm always like, why tell this story now? And it's because, well, like people are acting on this stuff. People are throwing away their plastic cutting boards, and people are ordering gray
Right.
market peptides from
Yeah.
China. I'm always really interested in trying to find that effective point of intervention as a journalist. I think about this a lot as an environmental journalist as well under the second Trump administration, because every day kind of feels like a five-alarm fire. And like so many of these things have like the day that like some policy is announced, and then there's this huge swath of intermediary time where things are sort of filtering through the courts and being argued about and debated, and it's hard to tell where anything begins and ends. And so I think that one of the challenges we're facing is like, what do people need to hear now? When is the most impactful time to tell a story? Like a couple of years ago, we did an episode on semaglutides and GLP-1s, and already I'm like, well, we have to redo that episode because the science has evolved a lot and the
Mhm.
understanding has evolved a lot. And I mean, it's a huge opportunity to be able to go back and be able to re-report things, but it's always tricky and fascinating, and sort of the stories that I get the most excited about, where it's like, again, it's not like throw all the stuff out the window, and yet I'm also not gonna tell people to rush out and inject themselves with the Barbie peptide that they ordered from, like, Gary Brecka's website or something. And so
Yeah.
trying to be able to wade into that nuance and hope that audiences do have a genuine appetite for it, and that they aren't gonna get super angry and email me when they listen to 75 minutes of nuanced microplastic content, and I do not try to sell them a bamboo cutting board at the end.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. I have done a little bit of reading about like the microplastic stuff, or at least, what was it, New York Times? Maybe it was a New Yorker article from Annie. I can't think of her last name, but like she basically like tried to go a week without
Oh,
touching
yeah, yeah, yeah,
microplastics.
yeah,
Yeah, and couldn't do it because like every can, it's like,
yeah, like, well, yeah,
yeah, yeah. It's like I was like, I like Coke Zero too much to
yeah,
not do
yeah.
this.
I mean, like, it just becomes extremely hard, like,
Yeah,
for so many of these things, you just, like, can't function in society, and I don't know, I mean, looking at the evidence doesn't suggest you need to, like, burn your house down and go live in the woods and only drink out of, like, a wooden chalice for the rest of your life, but
yeah,
also the answer isn't not changing anything. And so,
yeah,
like, the science is still really young. We don't have a lot of great prescriptions, even when, like, you talk for it's like the way they implement the knowledge gained from their research in daily life is pretty broad. Like, there's some folks who are like, "Don't dishwash my Tupperware anymore," and there's some folks that are like, "I don't know, I don't worry too much about it." Like,
yeah.
we've got big fish to fry, and so it's really challenging to figure out how to take unsettled and nascent science and turn it into something that a normal person would recognize as, like, entertaining content or vaguely entertaining content.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like, yesterday as I was, like, driving back from my workout and, was listening to, I don't know if it was a podcast or NPR, but there was, like, some ad that came up on it, and it was, like, from the Petroleum Association of America, and they had
Yeah,
something like,
they've
"Maybe
been
you."
advertising on The Daily a lot, and I'm always like,
That was it! I
"Wow."
was listening to The
Yeah.
Daily. I was listening to The Daily. I was listening to the episode about Backrooms and Obsession, which are, like, 2 YouTube,
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
The
so that were, like,
Zoomer
YouTube
horror
now, yeah.
sensation.
Yeah, exactly, like, how, like, Gen Z video is, like, is, like, bringing them back. They both look like good movies, I wanna see 'em. But anyway, they
They
made, like,
are
the
both very good, would recommend. Super
okay,
fun.
cool. Yeah, I see some clips of Obsession, it looked really good. And, I had to change the where I was doing this booth, although it didn't make much of a difference because I feel like I'm in a little bit of a back room when the
I
second
get
floor
it,
is,
it's
like,
like you are
beige.
in yeah.
I'm in this, like, corporate co-working space, and it's, like, definitely got, like, liminal space vibes. Everything's sort of
Yeah, yeah.
beige. Yeah. It's everything looks like vanilla. Um, but, like, where was I going with that? Something about, oh, yeah, because, like, I wonder if there's something there around, like, I mean, we are just swimming in petroleum. Like, we live in a petro state, right? And, like, we all kind of
Yes.
do to an extent, and so, like, that's, I think, the system like, it's everything's plastic now, and then what's so
Yeah,
striking about it is, like, what, like, 90 years ago even? Like, it was not the case, right? So, like, the
yeah,
rise of petroleum artifacts around us is, like, very recent history. I would be
yeah.
curious about, like, that as well, of how it's had permeated our economy and society in ways that are, like, really radical without our realizing it, and, man, I don't know, maybe, like, the Tupperware there's probably been some, like, Netflix documentary around Tupperware, but, like, it seems like
They're so There's a new Netflix documentary called what is it? The Plastic Detox, and it is one of the most heinous examples of poor science community. Like,
Yeah.
I someday, when I have free time, I'm gonna make a drinking game for it, of, like, every time they have an unfalsifiable claim or they use a sample size, like, of 2, like, it's a fully unhinged, like, pulling
Mhm.
on people's heartstrings, talking about fertility, there's one scientist in the whole thing kinda documentary.
I wonder
They
too,
rated that though.
and what would be interesting too, right? Like, to your point, it's like cutting out your, like, the black utensil cooking thing, the black plastic utensil that we all had in college, and replacing that with something that's, like, wooden or more sustainable, and, like, that will make you feel like you're doing better, and yet then, like, every other thing around you from your
Right,
car
like,
to your
look at, like,
house.
like, the reason we have that we keep using so much plastic is because we live in a petro state, and we
Yeah,
continue to vote for people who are, like, reinforcing that, and so, like, sure, buy your bamboo, ladle, that's amazing, great, everyone should make the decisions that feel good in their own personal life, but if you do that and don't also, like, pull on those political levers, then you're just, like, A, you're not really helping yourself that much, and you're certainly condemning less privileged people to have to, like, deal with the downstream impacts of your, like, inability to think on, like, a systems level.
yeah. Well, with that, thank you so much. That's a great way of
Yeah,
ending it. I
not
wanna end with
privileged,
systems level. This is which is so much of your work. I really appreciate everything you do, Zoe. Thank you for taking some time
yeah,
today.
thanks so much for having me, this was super fun.
Yeah, and thank you folks for watching, and please go watch some World Cup, and I hope folks if you don't have the holiday, have a wonderful weekend and enjoy your Friday, and, thanks so much. Appreciate it. This was a lot of fun. Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.